Our story begins in the glittering yet morally complex court of Restoration England, where King Charles II transformed the role of royal mistress from a shameful secret into a public institution. Born in 1630, Charles Stuart lived through some of the most turbulent decades in English history. His father, Charles I, had been executed during the English Civil War, and young Charles spent years in exile, learning the bitter lessons of survival in foreign courts where intrigue was currency and trust was a luxury few could afford. When Charles II was restored to the English throne in 1660, he brought with him not just a crown, but a continental sophistication regarding matters of the heart that would scandalize the traditionally puritanical English court. Unlike his predecessors who maintained their extramarital affairs as closely guarded secrets, Charles II elevated his mistresses to unprecedented levels of public prominence and political influence. This wasn't merely royal indulgence. It was a deliberate restructuring of court hierarchy that would fundamentally alter the balance of power in English politics. The king's approach to his relationships was both pragmatic and passionate. He understood that in a world where royal marriages were political alliances rather than love matches, the emotional and physical needs of the monarch required alternative outlets. But Charles went further than simple satisfaction. He created a parallel court structure where his mistresses became unofficial advisors, power brokers, and political players in their own right. This system, while shocking to contemporary moralists, actually served to strengthen royal authority by creating multiple channels of influence and information that flowed directly to the king. Barbara Villiers, later Countess of Castlemaine, was perhaps the most politically significant of Charles II's many mistresses. Their relationship began before his restoration and continued for over a decade, producing 5 acknowledged illegitimate children who would be granted noble titles and significant roles in English society. Barbara was not content to remain a passive recipient of royal favor. She actively involved herself in court politics, selling offices, influencing appointments, and even conducting her own diplomatic correspondence with foreign courts. What made Barbara particularly formidable was her understanding that her position as royal mistress was inherently temporary and precarious. Unlike a queen, whose status was secured by marriage and ceremony, a favorite could be dismissed at royal whim. This reality drove Barbara to accumulate as much political capital and financial security as possible during her years of influence. She demanded properties, pensions, and positions for her relatives, creating a vast network of dependents who had vested interests in maintaining her favor with the king. The relationship between Charles and Barbara also illuminated the complex dynamics of power within the royal court. While the king held ultimate authority, Barbara's influence over his daily life, his moods, and his decision-making processes gave her a form of power that even senior ministers had to acknowledge and accommodate. Foreign ambassadors learned that securing Barbara's support could be more valuable than formal diplomatic channels, leading to the extraordinary situation where a king's mistress was receiving gifts and correspondence from heads of state across Europe. Barbara's political involvement extended beyond mere court intrigue into matters of national significance. During the Anglo-Dutch Wars, she advocated for certain military strategies and commanders, influenced by both personal relationships and financial considerations. Her support or opposition to particular policies could determine their success or failure, not through formal authority but through her ability to shape the king's opinions during their private moments together. The children born from this relationship presented unique challenges to traditional concepts of royal succession and legitimacy. While they could not inherit the throne, Charles II's acknowledgement of them and his granting of noble titles created a new category of royal offspring, legitimate bastards who occupied positions somewhere between commoners and true royalty. These children would go on to found important noble families and play significant roles in English politics for generations to come. Louise de Keroualle, who became Duchess of Portsmouth, represented a different model of royal favoritism, one that was explicitly political from its inception. Unlike Barbara, whose relationship with Charles began from personal attraction and evolved into political influence, Louise was essentially a French agent placed in the English court to advance the diplomatic interests of Louis XIV. Her relationship with Charles II was carefully orchestrated by the French court as part of a broader strategy to align English foreign policy with French interests. Louise's appointment as royal mistress was the result of complex negotiations between the French and English courts, with the young woman serving as both a diplomatic gift and a living symbol of the alliance between the two kingdoms. This arrangement highlighted how royal relationships had evolved beyond personal matters into instruments of international diplomacy. Through Louise, the French court could influence English policy decisions, gather intelligence about English military and political plans, and maintain a direct channel of communication with the English king that bypassed official diplomatic channels. The Duchess's influence over Charles II was carefully cultivated and strategically deployed. Unlike Barbara's tempestuous and emotional relationship with the king, Louise maintained a more calculated approach, using her charm and intelligence to gradually shape Charles's opinions on key political matters. She advocated for religious tolerance for English Catholics, supported pro-French foreign policy positions, and worked to undermine political figures who opposed French interests. Louise's success as a political operative disguised as a royal mistress demonstrated the sophisticated ways in which European courts had learned to manipulate personal relationships for diplomatic advantage. Her presence in the English court represented a new form of international espionage, one that operated through intimate rather than official channels. The intelligence she gathered and the influence she wielded made her one of the most valuable French assets in England, worth far more than any traditional spy or diplomat. The third major figure in Charles II's constellation of favorites was Nell Gwyn, who represented yet another model of royal relationship, the common-born mistress who rose to prominence through wit, charm, and genuine affection rather than political calculation. Nell's background as an orange seller and actress made her relationship with the king a source of popular fascination and, surprisingly, public approval. Unlike the aristocratic Barbara or the foreign Louise, Nell was seen as authentically English and genuinely devoted to the king's personal happiness rather than political advancement. Nell's approach to her position was notably different from her more politically ambitious counterparts. While she certainly benefited financially from the king's favor and secured noble titles for her children, she seemed more interested in entertaining Charles than in influencing his policies. Her quick wit and irreverent humor provided the king with a form of companionship that was apparently unavailable in his formal court relationships or his politically motivated liaisons. The public's affection for Nell Gwyn revealed important insights into popular attitudes toward royal morality and legitimacy. While many English subjects disapproved of the king's numerous affairs in principle, they made an exception for Nell because she was perceived as genuinely English and unpretentious. Her common origins made her seem more relatable and less threatening than aristocratic or foreign mistresses who might harbor political ambitions that could harm English interests. Nell's relationship with Charles also highlighted the theatrical nature of royal court life. As a professional actress, she understood the importance of public performance and image management in ways that her rivals did not. She cultivated a persona of loyal, patriotic English womanhood that served as an effective counterpoint to accusations that the king was too influenced by foreign agents or aristocratic conspirators. The system of royal favorites established by Charles II created lasting changes in English court culture and political practice. By openly acknowledging his mistresses and granting them official recognition, Charles normalized the institution of royal favoritism in ways that would influence his successors for generations. Future monarchs would be expected to manage their personal relationships with similar openness and political sophistication. The competition between Charles II's various mistresses also established patterns of court intrigue that would become standard features of royal politics. The need to maintain royal favor while undermining rivals created a complex ecosystem of alliance and betrayal that extended far beyond the women directly involved. Courtiers, ministers, and foreign diplomats all had to navigate these personal relationships as part of their professional duties. Perhaps most significantly, the prominence of royal mistresses during Charles II's reign demonstrated how unofficial relationships could become official sources of political power. This precedent would prove deeply influential in continental European courts, where the French model of royal favoritism was already well established but had not previously been adopted so openly in Protestant kingdoms. The financial arrangements surrounding Charles II's favorites also established important precedents for how monarchs would manage the costs of maintaining multiple households and providing for illegitimate children. The king's generosity toward his mistresses and their offspring represented a significant drain on royal resources, but it also served important political functions by binding influential families to the monarchy through financial dependence. The international dimensions of Charles II's relationships, particularly his liaison with Louise de Keroualle, prefigured the ways in which royal favorites would become instruments of diplomatic policy throughout European courts. The success of the French strategy in placing Louise as a royal mistress encouraged other courts to attempt similar manipulations, leading to an arms race of sorts in the deployment of attractive agents within rival kingdoms. As we conclude this first exploration of unusual royal relationships, we see how Charles II's reign fundamentally transformed the role of royal favorites from private indulgences into public institutions. His mistresses became political players in their own right, wielding influence that extended far beyond the bedroom into matters of war, diplomacy, and succession. The system he established would echo through European courts for centuries to come, as other monarchs learned to balance personal desire with political necessity in increasingly sophisticated ways. The legacy of Charles II's approach to royal relationships extended well beyond his own reign. His success in maintaining multiple high-profile liaisons while preserving political stability demonstrated that unconventional personal arrangements could coexist with effective governance, provided they were managed with sufficient skill and openness. This lesson would prove particularly influential in continental European courts, where royal favoritism would evolve into even more elaborate and politically significant forms. The transition from the openly scandalous court of Charles II to the supposedly pristine royal marriage of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette reveals how the politics of royal relationships had evolved by the late 18th century. Where Charles II had openly flaunted his mistresses as symbols of royal virility and political sophistication, the French court of Versailles attempted to present an image of marital harmony and dynastic stability that masked far more complex and troubling realities. The marriage between Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette in 1770 was orchestrated as the ultimate diplomatic alliance, designed to cement the newly formed friendship between France and Austria after centuries of conflict. Marie Antoinette, daughter of Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, was selected not for personal compatibility with the French Dauphin, but as a living symbol of international reconciliation and a guarantee of Austrian good faith in their alliance with France. The 14-year-old Archduchess who arrived at Versailles was already a pawn in a larger game of European power politics that would define every aspect of her relationship with her future husband and her adopted country. The elaborate ceremony of her symbolic rebirth as a French princess, where she was literally stripped of her Austrian clothes and redressed in French attire at the border, prefigured the ways in which her entire existence would be subordinated to the needs of French royal propaganda. From the beginning, the marriage was haunted by political expectations that would prove impossible to fulfill. Marie Antoinette was expected to serve simultaneously as a channel for Austrian influence over French policy and as a symbol of French royal legitimacy. These contradictory roles created tensions that would plague her entire reign and contribute significantly to the revolutionary fury that would eventually consume both her and her husband. The personal relationship between Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette was complicated from the outset by the political pressures surrounding their union and by fundamental incompatibilities of temperament and interest. Louis, deeply serious and interested in mechanical arts and hunting, found little common ground with his wife's love of fashion, gambling, and court entertainment. Their different approaches to royal duty, his conscientious but plodding attention to administrative detail versus her instinctive understanding of the theatrical aspects of monarchy, created persistent friction that was eagerly exploited by their political enemies. Perhaps most damaging to their relationship and their political standing was their failure to consummate their marriage for 7 years after their wedding. This extraordinary delay, which became the subject of intense speculation and ridicule throughout Europe, highlighted the ways in which royal marriages were inherently public rather than private matters. Every aspect of their intimate life became a matter of state concern, with ambassadors reporting home about the couple's sleeping arrangements and court physicians offering detailed analyses of their sexual difficulties. The causes of this prolonged marital dysfunction remain controversial among historians, with explanations ranging from Louis's alleged physical abnormality to the couple's mutual inexperience and emotional immaturity. Whatever the underlying causes, the very public nature of their sexual difficulties created a crisis of royal legitimacy that reverberated throughout the French political system. A king who could not produce an heir was a king whose divine mandate was questionable, and the political implications of royal impotence became increasingly dangerous as financial and social pressures mounted throughout France. Marie Antoinette's response to these pressures was to immerse herself increasingly deeply in the elaborate social rituals of Versailles, creating a parallel court centered around fashion, gambling, and elaborate entertainments. This strategy, while perhaps psychologically necessary for her personal survival, proved politically disastrous by reinforcing perceptions of her as frivolous and disconnected from the sufferings of ordinary French subjects. The Queen's creation of her private retreat at the Petit Trianon represented an attempt to escape the suffocating protocols of Versailles and create a space where she could exercise genuine personal choice. However, this perfectly understandable desire for privacy was interpreted by her critics as evidence of her foreign nature and her contempt for French traditions. The elaborate rustic fantasy she created at Trianon, where she could play at being a simple shepherdess while maintaining all the privileges of royalty, became a symbol of aristocratic decadence that revolutionary propagandists would exploit with devastating effectiveness. The political dimensions of the royal marriage became increasingly complex as France's financial crisis deepened throughout the 1770s and 1780s. Marie Antoinette's Austrian origins made her a convenient scapegoat for France's diplomatic and military failures, with critics arguing that her divided loyalties prevented her from fully supporting French interests. The Queen's correspondence with her mother and brothers in Austria, while largely ceremonial, provided ammunition for those who sought to portray her as a foreign agent working to undermine French sovereignty. The birth of the couple's first child in 1778, 8 years after their marriage, temporarily stabilized their political position by demonstrating their ability to produce heirs and continue the Bourbon dynasty. However, the relief this provided was short-lived, as the Queen's subsequent pregnancies and the high infant mortality rate among royal children created new anxieties about dynastic continuity. Each pregnancy became a matter of intense public scrutiny, with detailed bulletins about the Queen's condition distributed throughout Europe and analyzed for their political implications. Marie Antoinette's relationship with her children revealed aspects of her personality that contradicted the popular image of her as purely frivolous and self-centered. Her letters describe a mother who was genuinely devoted to her offspring and deeply affected by their illnesses and deaths. However, even her maternal feelings became politicized, with critics arguing that her Austrian upbringing had made her incapable of raising properly French heirs to the throne. The Queen's attempts to influence her husband's political decisions created additional controversies that highlighted the impossible position of royal wives in the absolutist system. When she remained silent on political matters, she was criticized as useless and decorative. When she offered opinions or tried to shape policy, she was condemned as interfering and inappropriately ambitious. Her support for certain ministers and policies, particularly those that seemed to favor Austrian interests, was interpreted as evidence of her treasonous loyalties. The diamond necklace affair of 1785 represented the culmination of the public's growing hostility toward Marie Antoinette and demonstrated how royal scandals could destabilize entire political systems. Although the Queen was completely innocent of any wrongdoing in this elaborate fraud, the public's willingness to believe the worst about her revealed the extent to which her reputation had been damaged by years of propaganda and her own political missteps. The affair also highlighted how royal women were particularly vulnerable to character assassination because their political power was largely informal and dependent on personal relationships rather than institutional authority. A male monarch could survive scandalous accusations by asserting his divine right to rule, but a queen's authority was always contingent on public acceptance of her moral character and her proper fulfillment of feminine virtues. As France moved toward revolution in the late 1780s, the royal marriage became both a symbol of everything that was wrong with the old regime and a rallying point for conservative forces seeking to preserve traditional monarchy. The couple's increasing isolation at Versailles, surrounded by courtiers who were either unable or unwilling to provide them with accurate information about the growing crisis, contributed to their political paralysis and ultimate downfall. The revolutionary period revealed the extent to which the personal had become political in royal marriages. Marie Antoinette's private letters were published and analyzed for evidence of treason. Her relationship with her children was scrutinized for signs of improper foreign influence, and even her clothing choices were interpreted as political statements. The revolutionaries understood intuitively that destroying the monarchy required destroying not just the institution but the personal relationships that sustained it. The trial and execution of both Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette represented the ultimate politicization of royal marriage, with their relationship itself becoming evidence of the corruption and illegitimacy of the monarchical system. The revolutionaries' obsession with documenting every aspect of their private lives during their imprisonment reflected a broader understanding that royal marriages were inherently public institutions that could be held accountable to popular judgment. The tragic end of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette's marriage revealed the fundamental contradictions inherent in royal relationships under the absolutist system. Expected to embody both private virtue and public grandeur, to represent both national identity and international alliance, to demonstrate both human feeling and superhuman authority, royal couples were subjected to impossible pressures that few marriages could survive. Their story also illuminated the gendered nature of royal scandal and the particular vulnerabilities of royal women in political systems that granted them informal influence but no formal protection. Marie Antoinette's fate demonstrated how quickly a queen could be transformed from a symbol of legitimacy into a scapegoat for national failures, and how the politics of personal relationships could determine the fate of entire dynasties. The legacy of their marriage extended far beyond their own tragic deaths to influence how subsequent royal families would manage the relationship between private feeling and public duty. The revolutionary critique of royal marriage as inherently corrupting and anti-democratic would shape Republican ideology for generations, while the martyrdom of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette would inspire romantic monarchist movements throughout the 19th century. The relationship between royal power and religious authority has always been one of the most complex and politically charged aspects of monarchy, but few stories illustrate this tension more dramatically than the epic confrontation between King Henry VIII of England and the papal establishment in Rome. What began as a personal marital problem evolved into a religious revolution that would reshape not only English society but the entire balance of power between secular and spiritual authority throughout Europe. Henry VIII's early relationship with the Catholic Church was marked by genuine piety and strong support for papal authority. As a young king, he had earned the title Defender of the Faith from Pope Leo X for his vigorous written defense of Catholic doctrine against the emerging Protestant Reformation. His early marriages, his participation in Catholic rituals, and his generous support for monasteries and religious institutions all suggested a monarch who understood his role as a faithful son of the Church and a protector of Catholic orthodoxy. The transformation of Henry from papal champion to papal enemy was driven initially by the most personal of royal concerns: the need for a legitimate male heir to secure the Tudor dynasty. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon, while politically advantageous as an alliance with Spain, had produced only one surviving child, Princess Mary. After nearly 20 years of marriage and multiple miscarriages, it became clear that Catherine would not provide the son Henry believed essential for political stability. The king's growing obsession with his lack of a male heir was intensified by his emerging passion for Anne Boleyn, a young woman at court whose intelligence, education, and calculated resistance to his advances made her far more intriguing than the usual royal mistresses. Unlike previous royal affairs, Henry's relationship with Anne was complicated by her insistence that she would not become his mistress but would only accept the position of queen, a demand that would require the annulment of his existing marriage. Henry's initial approach to resolving his marital difficulties followed traditional diplomatic channels, seeking papal approval for an annulment based on canonical arguments about the validity of his marriage to his brother's widow. The king genuinely believed that his lack of male heirs represented divine punishment for violating biblical prohibitions against marrying a brother's wife, and he expected the Pope to recognize the theological logic of his position and grant the requested annulment. However, the political realities of early 16th century Europe made papal cooperation with Henry's request virtually impossible. Pope Clement VII was effectively a prisoner of Emperor Charles V, Catherine of Aragon's nephew, who had no intention of allowing his aunt to be humiliated by an English annulment. The Pope found himself caught between his traditional role as arbiter of Christian marriage and the brutal political pressures of imperial politics. The deadlock over the annulment revealed the fundamental tensions between papal claims to spiritual authority and the practical needs of royal governance. Henry's frustration with Rome's inability or unwillingness to resolve his marital crisis led him to explore alternative sources of religious authority that might prove more responsive to royal requirements. The emerging Protestant theology, with its emphasis on royal supremacy over religious matters, provided a theological framework for challenging papal authority. The king's gradual break with Rome was orchestrated through a series of carefully planned legislative and administrative measures designed to transfer religious authority from the Pope to the English crown. The Act of Supremacy of 1534 formally declared Henry to be the supreme head of the Church of England, effectively establishing a national church under royal control that could address the king's marital problems without reference to papal opinion. This religious revolution was not merely a matter of personal convenience for Henry. It represented a fundamental restructuring of the relationship between church and state that would have profound implications for English society and politics. By asserting royal supremacy over religious matters, Henry was claiming a form of authority that had previously been reserved to the Pope and challenging the medieval concept of divided sovereignty between temporal and spiritual power. The dissolution of the monasteries that followed Henry's break with Rome demonstrated the practical consequences of this new arrangement between royal power and religious authority. The seizure of monastic properties provided the crown with enormous wealth while simultaneously eliminating potential centers of opposition to the new religious settlement. The redistribution of this property to loyal nobles and merchants created powerful constituencies with vested interests in maintaining the break with Rome. Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn, conducted in secret before his annulment from Catherine was finalized, illustrated the ways in which personal relationships could drive major political and religious changes. Anne's influence over the king during their courtship had encouraged his exploration of Protestant theology and his challenge to papal authority. Her coronation as queen represented not just a personal triumph but a symbolic victory for the English Reformation. However, Anne's failure to produce the promised male heir she gave birth to the future Elizabeth I ultimately led to her downfall and execution on charges of adultery and treason. The speed with which Henry moved from passionate devotion to and to ordering her death revealed the brutal logic of royal relationships when they became entangled with dynastic politics and religious revolution. The king's subsequent marriages continued to reflect the complex interplay between personal desire, political necessity, and religious authority. His marriage to Jane Seymour finally produced the longed-for male heir, Prince Edward, but Jane's death shortly after childbirth left Henry once again seeking a wife who could provide both personal companionship and political advantage. The marriage to Anne of Cleves, arranged as part of Henry's foreign policy alignment with Protestant German princes, demonstrated how the king's break with Rome had opened new possibilities for diplomatic marriages that would have been impossible under the old Catholic system. However, Henry's personal distaste for and led to another annulment, this time granted by his own ecclesiastical courts without reference to any external authority. Catherine Howard, Henry's fifth wife, represented yet another attempt to combine personal passion with political advantage. Her youth and beauty attracted the aging king, while her family connections promised to strengthen certain court factions. However, her execution for adultery revealed the dangers that royal wives faced when their personal behavior could be interpreted as threatening to royal authority or dynastic security. Henry's final marriage to Catherine Parr illustrated the evolution of his approach to royal relationships in his later years. Catherine, a learned and pious woman with strong Protestant sympathies, provided the king with intellectual companionship and helped manage the complex religious politics of his final years. Her survival and her influence over the education of Henry's children demonstrated how royal wives could achieve security and influence through wisdom and careful political management rather than through beauty or passion alone. The religious settlement that Henry established in England created a unique form of national church that combined traditional Catholic ritual and hierarchy with royal supremacy and certain Protestant theological principles. This compromise reflected Henry's personal religious conservatism, as well as his political need to maintain stability while asserting independence from Rome. The international implications of Henry's break with Rome extended far beyond England to influence the broader European balance of power. His alliance with Protestant German princes created new diplomatic possibilities while simultaneously exposing England to the threat of Catholic crusade. The Pope's excommunication of Henry and his declaration that the king's subjects were released from their oaths of allegiance represented direct challenges to royal authority that had to be countered through military preparation and diplomatic maneuvering. Henry's relationship with Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury who presided over the English Reformation, illustrated the complex dynamics between royal power and clerical authority in the new system. Cranmer's theological expertise and his willingness to support royal policy made him an invaluable ally, but his Protestant convictions also created tensions with Henry's more conservative religious instincts. The role of Thomas Cromwell in orchestrating the legal and administrative aspects of the break with Rome demonstrated how royal relationships with key advisors could determine the success or failure of major policy initiatives. Cromwell's eventual fall and execution revealed the dangers that royal servants faced when their usefulness was exhausted or when their policies produced unwanted consequences. The education and upbringing of Henry's children reflected the complex religious legacy of his break with Rome. Edward VI's Protestant education, Mary's Catholic devotion, and Elizabeth's pragmatic religious flexibility all stemmed from different aspects of their father's religious policies and personal relationships. The succession crises and religious conflicts that followed Henry's death illustrated the long-term costs of subordinating religious policy to personal marital problems. Henry's legacy in terms of church-state relations established precedents that would influence English politics for centuries. The principle of royal supremacy over religious matters became a cornerstone of English constitutional development, while the identification of Protestantism with English national identity created lasting tensions with Catholic powers in Europe. The personal costs of Henry's religious revolution were enormous. The execution of faithful counselors like Thomas More and John Fisher, the destruction of ancient religious communities, the trauma inflicted on subjects forced to choose between religious conviction and political loyalty. These human consequences of the king's personal decisions illustrated the ways in which royal relationships could have devastating effects on entire societies. The ultimate irony of Henry's break with Rome was that it failed to achieve its primary objective, the establishment of a secure male succession. Edward VI's early death and the subsequent reigns of Mary and Elizabeth demonstrated that royal attempts to control dynastic succession through religious revolution could produce unintended consequences that lasted for generations. Throughout the corridors of European history, there exist crowns that gleam with unfulfilled promise, magnificent works of art and political symbolism that were crafted for monarchs who would never wear them, kingdoms that would never exist, or ceremonies that would never take place. These phantom crowns tell stories of thwarted ambition, political miscalculation, and the fragile nature of royal power itself. They represent dreams deferred, dynasties that collapsed before they could begin, and the eternal human tendency to reach for grandeur that remains forever just beyond grasp. Perhaps no crown tells a more poignant story of unrealized imperial ambition than the crown of Mexico. Crafted in Paris for Maximilian of Austria, the younger brother of Emperor Franz Joseph, who accepted Napoleon III's offer to become Emperor of Mexico in 1864. The crown itself was a masterpiece of 19th-century goldsmithing, adorned with emeralds, diamonds, and pearls, designed to evoke both European imperial tradition and indigenous Mexican heritage. Its creators intended it to symbolize the fusion of old-world legitimacy with new-world opportunity, but it would become instead a monument to imperial folly. Maximilian's acceptance of the Mexican crown was based on fundamentally flawed intelligence about Mexican politics and the true extent of popular support for European intervention. The French military advisors who encouraged his imperial adventure painted a picture of a country yearning for stable monarchy and European civilization, conveniently ignoring the fierce republican sentiment that had driven Mexico's struggle for independence and the strong nationalist resistance to foreign interference. The crown's elaborate design process revealed the disconnect between European perceptions of Mexico and Mexican realities. Parisian jewelers incorporated what they imagined to be authentically Mexican motifs, stylized representations of Aztec symbols and tropical flora, that bore little resemblance to actual Mexican artistic traditions. The result was a beautiful but culturally hollow creation that embodied the broader imperial project's failure to understand or respect Mexican identity. Maximilian's brief reign from 1864 to 1867 was marked by his gradual realization that the crown he had accepted represented an impossible position. Caught between French imperial interests, Mexican conservative factions, and Republican forces led by Benito Juárez, he found himself ruling a country that largely rejected his authority. His liberal instincts and genuine attempts at reform alienated his conservative supporters without winning over Republican opponents who viewed him as an illegitimate foreign imposer. The emperor's personal tragedy was compounded by his growing awareness that his imperial crown had been purchased with French lives and Mexican suffering. His correspondence with his wife Charlotte reveals a man increasingly tormented by the moral implications of his position and the impossibility of fulfilling his imperial obligations. The crown that had seemed to promise glory and purpose became instead a burden of guilt and responsibility. Charlotte's descent into madness during her desperate journey to Europe seeking support for her husband's tottering empire illustrated the psychological costs of imperial overreach. Her frantic appeals to Napoleon III and Pope Pius IX for aid reflected not just political desperation but the personal anguish of watching cherished dreams collapse into nightmare. The crown she had hoped to wear as Empress of Mexico became instead a symbol of her husband's doom and her own mental destruction. The execution of Maximilian by Republican forces in 1867 marked the definitive end of European imperial ambitions in Mexico, but the crown itself survived as a museum piece, a beautiful artifact of imperial hubris. Its fate paralleled that of many other crowns created for rulers whose reigns proved too brief or too contested to achieve their intended grandeur. The imperial crown of Brazil presents another fascinating case of royal headgear that achieved only partial fulfillment of its intended purpose. Created for the coronation of Pedro I in 1822, when Brazil declared independence from Portugal, the crown was designed to establish the legitimacy of the new Brazilian empire and demonstrate that South America could support genuine imperial institutions equal to those of Europe. Pedro I's decision to have himself crowned rather than accepting coronation from religious authorities reflected his determination to establish Brazilian imperial independence from both Portuguese colonial legacy and European ecclesiastical influence. The crown's design incorporated Brazilian gemstones and gold, creating a uniquely South American imperial symbol that nevertheless followed European artistic conventions. However, Pedro I's abdication in 1831 after less than 9 years of rule meant that the Brazilian imperial crown had a relatively brief period of active use. His son Pedro II, who ruled for nearly 60 years, rarely wore the crown in public ceremonies, preferring a more modest approach to imperial symbolism that reflected Brazil's unique position as a tropical empire in an age of republican revolution. The crown's ultimate obsolescence came with the establishment of the Brazilian Republic in 1889. When it was relegated to museum status as a relic of the imperial period. Unlike European crowns that maintained their symbolic significance even when not actively used, the Brazilian imperial crown became a curious artifact of a brief experiment in New World monarchy that most Brazilians came to view as an historical aberration. The story of Napoleon II's never-worn crown illustrates how royal symbolism could outlive the political realities it was meant to represent. When Napoleon I abdicated in 1814, he insisted that his young son be recognized as Napoleon II, Emperor of the French. A small crown was actually prepared for the child, designed to symbolize the continuity of the Napoleonic dynasty despite the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy. However, the boy who would have been Napoleon II never returned to France and never wore his crown. Raised in the Austrian court as the Duke of Reichstadt, he grew up isolated from French politics and died young in 1832 without ever attempting to claim his father's legacy. The crown prepared for him became a symbol of Napoleonic dreams that survived the emperor's political defeat but could not overcome the practical realities of European power politics. The crown's existence served the psychological needs of Napoleonic loyalists, who maintained the fiction that legitimate imperial authority resided in the exiled child rather than in the restored Bourbon kings. This symbolic politics of the unused crown would later influence the successful return of Napoleonic prestige under Napoleon III, who understood how powerful royal symbols could remain even when separated from actual power. Perhaps most tragically poignant is the story of the Romanov coronation crown prepared for the planned but never realized coronation of Nicholas II and Alexander's son Alexei. As the hemophiliac heir to the Russian throne, Alexei's future coronation represented both the continuation of Romanov dynasty and the persistent hope that his medical condition might be overcome or managed sufficiently to allow him to fulfill his imperial destiny. The child's crown, scaled down from the magnificent imperial crown of Russia, incorporated all the traditional symbols of Romanov authority while acknowledging the special circumstances of his condition. Court officials spent considerable time planning ceremonial modifications that would accommodate Alexei's physical limitations while maintaining the essential dignity of imperial ritual. The 1918 execution of the entire Romanov family meant that Alexei's crown joined the ranks of royal regalia that would never fulfill their intended purpose. The crown's fate symbolized not just the end of a particular dynasty but the violent termination of the entire Russian imperial system. Unlike crowns that simply became obsolete through political change, Alexei's crown was rendered meaningless by the literal extinction of the bloodline it was meant to adorn. The crown of Poland, recreated multiple times for rulers who hoped to restore Polish independence, represents a different category of unrealized royal ambition. Throughout the periods of Polish partition and foreign domination, various claimants to Polish royal authority commissioned crowns that symbolized their determination to restore national sovereignty and legitimate monarchy. These Polish crowns were created in exile, often with limited resources but unlimited hope. They served as rallying symbols for Polish nationalist movements and as tangible representations of the belief that foreign domination was temporary and that legitimate Polish authority would eventually be restored. The crown's creators understood that royal symbolism could maintain political aspirations even when separated from actual political power. The failure of most attempts to restore Polish monarchy meant that these crowns remained symbols of unfulfilled nationalism rather than instruments of actual royal authority. However, their existence demonstrates how royal regalia could serve important psychological and political functions even when divorced from practical governance. The Irish crown prepared for James II attempted restoration in 1689 to 1691 illustrates how crowns could embody both dynastic ambition and national resistance. James's effort to use Ireland as a base for recovering his English and Scottish thrones required the creation of royal regalia that would legitimize his authority and rally Irish Catholic support for his cause. The crown's Irish provenance and Catholic symbolism were intended to distinguish James's restoration effort from the Protestant usurpation he opposed. However, his defeat at the Battle of the Boyne and his subsequent exile meant that the Irish crown became another artifact of failed royal ambition, preserved as a relic of the last serious attempt to restore Catholic monarchy to the British Isles. These stories of unworn crowns reveal fundamental truths about the nature of royal authority and political legitimacy. They demonstrate that royal symbolism, while powerful, cannot overcome political realities or popular opposition. They show how royal ambitions often exceed royal capabilities, and how the gap between ceremonial grandeur and practical governance can become unbridgeable. The artisans who created these crowns worked with the same skill and dedication they brought to regalia that would be used for centuries. They understood that their creations were meant to embody eternal principles of royal authority and divine sanction, regardless of the immediate political circumstances surrounding their commission. Their craftsmanship represents a form of faith in the enduring significance of monarchy that transcended particular dynastic failures. The preservation of these unused crowns in museums and archives serves contemporary functions that their creators never anticipated. They have become teaching tools for understanding the relationship between symbolism and power, artifacts that illustrate the gap between royal aspirations and political realities, and works of art that can be appreciated independently of their original political purposes. The death of a monarch has always been far more than a personal tragedy. It represents a moment of supreme political vulnerability when the entire structure of royal authority hangs in the balance. Throughout history, the circumstances surrounding royal deaths have generated suspicion, conspiracy theories, and political upheaval that can reshape entire kingdoms. The question of whether a royal death was natural or the result of political manipulation has driven some of history's most enduring mysteries and most consequential power struggles. The sudden death of King Charles I of England in 1649 stands as perhaps the most unambiguous case of political execution in royal history, yet even this seemingly clear-cut regicide has generated centuries of debate about its true nature and consequences. The public trial and execution of Charles I by parliamentary forces represented an unprecedented challenge to the divine right of kings and established dangerous precedents that would haunt European monarchies for generations. However, the political maneuvering that led to Charles's execution began long before his final moments on the scaffold outside Whitehall Palace. The English Civil War had created a situation where the king's continued existence posed an insurmountable obstacle to parliamentary authority and republican governance. The decision to try and execute Charles was not the result of sudden revolutionary fervor, but rather the calculated conclusion that the monarchy itself had to be destroyed to prevent future royal challenges to parliamentary supremacy. The king's own behavior during his captivity and trial revealed his understanding that his death had become a political necessity for his enemies. His dignified bearing during the proceedings and his eloquent final speeches were designed not to save his life, which he recognized as forfeit, but to create a powerful martyrdom that might inspire future royalist resistance. Charles understood that how he died would be as politically significant as the fact of his death. The execution's aftermath demonstrated the complex political calculations surrounding royal death. The immediate establishment of the Commonwealth under Oliver Cromwell represented an attempt to fill the power vacuum created by regicide, but the Republic's ultimate failure and the restoration of monarchy under Charles II in 1660 suggested that killing a king might be easier than eliminating the institution of monarchy itself. The mysterious death of Edward II of England in 1327 presents a far more ambiguous case where political necessity, personal vengeance, and royal vulnerability intersected in ways that have never been fully clarified. Edward's forced abdication in favor of his young son Edward III was orchestrated by his wife Isabella and her lover Roger Mortimer, who had returned from French exile with a small army to challenge the king's authority. Edward II's reign had been marked by military failures, political conflicts with his barons, and scandals surrounding his intimate relationships with male favorites, particularly Piers Gaveston and Hugh Despenser. These controversies had gradually eroded royal authority and created the political conditions that made his deposition possible. However, the decision to kill the deposed king rather than simply keeping him in captivity suggested deeper fears about his potential for future political mischief. The official cause of Edward II's death was listed as natural causes, but contemporary accounts and later investigations have suggested that he was murdered in Berkeley Castle in a manner designed to leave no external marks of violence. The alleged method of execution, insertion of a red-hot poker into his bowels, was reportedly chosen both for its symbolic significance as punishment for his supposed sexual deviance and for its ability to cause death without obvious evidence of murder. The political implications of Edward II's death extended far beyond the immediate succession crisis. His son Edward III's eventual assumption of personal rule was accompanied by the execution of Roger Mortimer and the political marginalization of Isabella, suggesting that the young king viewed his father's death as a crime that required punishment rather than a political necessity that should be accepted. The death of Queen Elizabeth I in 1603 illustrates how even apparently natural royal deaths could generate political uncertainty and conspiracy theories that persisted for generations. Elizabeth's refusal to marry or name a clear successor had created a succession crisis that threatened to plunge England into civil war upon her death. Her final illness and death at Richmond Palace were closely monitored by court officials and foreign ambassadors, who understood that the Queen's last moments would determine the future of English politics. The official accounts of Elizabeth's death described a gradual decline consistent with old age and the stresses of long rule, but alternative theories have suggested that she might have been poisoned by court factions seeking to influence the succession. The Queen's well-documented paranoia about assassination attempts and her reliance on food tasters and other security measures demonstrated her awareness of the political dangers surrounding royal mortality. Elizabeth's deathbed designation of James VI of Scotland as her successor represented a political masterstroke that prevented civil war and ensured the peaceful union of the English and Scottish crowns. However, the secretive nature of this designation and the rapid moves to secure James's recognition as James I of England suggested careful political management of the royal death that went far beyond natural processes of succession. The sudden death of Napoleon Bonaparte on the island of St. Helena in 1821 has generated more conspiracy theories and forensic investigations than perhaps any other royal death in history. The official cause of death was listed as stomach cancer, but the circumstances of his exile, the British government's obvious interest in preventing his return to European politics, and the symptoms he displayed during his final illness have fueled persistent suspicions of arsenic poisoning. Napoleon's own awareness of his precarious position and his knowledge that his continued existence posed a threat to the European settlement established after his defeat at Waterloo colored his final years with paranoia and suspicion. His detailed complaints about his treatment by British authorities and his accusations of deliberate mistreatment were designed not just to secure better conditions but to create a historical record that would support theories of martyrdom if he died in captivity. The forensic analysis of Napoleon's hair samples conducted in the 20th century revealed elevated levels of arsenic, but scientific opinion remains divided about whether these levels were sufficient to cause death or merely reflected the environmental conditions of early 19th century life. The ambiguity of the scientific evidence has allowed both supporters and skeptics of the poisoning theory to maintain their positions while keeping the controversy alive. The political implications of Napoleon's death extended far beyond questions of causation to encompass the broader legitimacy of the European settlement that followed his defeat. If Napoleon had been murdered by his British captors, it would suggest that the European powers were so threatened by his potential return that they were willing to violate the conventions of civilized warfare and political exile that supposedly governed international relations. The death of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary in Sarajevo in 1914 represents perhaps the most consequential royal assassination in history, triggering a chain of events that would lead to World War I and the collapse of several European empires. However, the political maneuvering surrounding Ferdinand's death began long before the fatal shots were fired and continued long after his funeral. Franz Ferdinand's position as heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne had made him a target for various nationalist groups seeking to prevent the continuation of Habsburg rule over their territories. His known sympathies for federal reform that might have granted greater autonomy to ethnic minorities within the empire had paradoxically made him enemies among both conservative Austrians who opposed reform and radical nationalists who preferred revolution to gradual change. The assassination itself was the result of careful planning by Serbian nationalist conspirators who understood that killing the Archduke would likely provoke an Austrian military response that could escalate into a broader European conflict. The assassins' willingness to sacrifice their own lives for their political goals demonstrated the extent to which royal death had become a deliberate instrument of political change rather than merely a tragic accident. The Austrian government's response to Ferdinand's assassination revealed how royal deaths could be exploited to justify predetermined political objectives. The ultimatum delivered to Serbia and the subsequent declaration of war suggested that Austrian leaders viewed the Archduke's death primarily as an opportunity to resolve the South Slavic question through military force rather than as a tragedy requiring measured justice. The mysterious death of Ludwig II of Bavaria in 1886 illustrates how royal deaths could be engineered through medical and legal manipulation rather than direct violence. Ludwig's deposition on grounds of mental incapacity was orchestrated by Bavarian government officials who viewed his eccentric behavior and expensive building projects as threats to the kingdom's financial stability and political credibility. The king's death by drowning in Lake Starnberg, along with his physician Dr. Bernhard von Gudden, occurred within hours of his deposition and under circumstances that have never been satisfactorily explained. The official verdict of suicide was contradicted by the absence of water in Ludwig's lungs and other forensic evidence that suggested he might have been murdered by agents seeking to prevent his escape or his potential restoration to power. Ludwig's case demonstrated how royal deaths could be disguised as medical or psychiatric crises rather than political executions. The use of mental health professionals to validate the king's unfitness for rule and to provide medical supervision during his final days created a veneer of scientific legitimacy that masked what may have been a carefully orchestrated political assassination. The death of Tsar Alexander II of Russia in 1881 represented the culmination of years of revolutionary attempts to destabilize the Russian monarchy through targeted assassination. The Tsar's commitment to reform, including the emancipation of the serfs and other liberal measures, had paradoxically made him a target for radical revolutionaries who viewed gradual reform as an obstacle to revolutionary change. The successful bombing that killed Alexander II was the result of elaborate planning by the People's Will Organization, which had made multiple previous attempts on the Tsar's life. The assassins understood that royal death could serve revolutionary purposes by demonstrating the vulnerability of autocratic authority and inspiring further resistance to the imperial system. However, the political consequences of Alexander II's assassination were largely counterproductive to revolutionary goals. His son Alexander III responded to his father's death by implementing harsh repressive measures that effectively crushed the revolutionary movement for a generation. The royal death that was intended to inspire revolution instead strengthened conservative forces and delayed democratic reform in Russia. The suspicious death of King Alexander I of Yugoslavia in 1934 during a state visit to France illustrates how royal assassinations had evolved to serve international political objectives in the 20th century. The king's efforts to maintain Yugoslav unity and independence from both German and Italian influence had made him a target for various nationalist and fascist groups seeking to destabilize the Balkans. The assassination was carried out by a Bulgarian revolutionary with connections to Croatian separatist organizations and possibly to foreign intelligence services. The complexity of the conspiracy and the international implications of the king's death demonstrated how royal mortality had become entangled with broader patterns of European political violence and territorial ambition. These cases of royal death, whether clearly political or mysteriously ambiguous, reveal fundamental truths about the nature of monarchy and political power. They demonstrate that royal authority, despite its claims to divine sanction and hereditary legitimacy, remained ultimately dependent on human acceptance and political circumstances that could change dramatically. The enduring fascination with royal deaths and the conspiracy theories they generate reflects a deeper understanding that the death of a monarch represents more than just the end of an individual life. It marks a moment when the entire political order becomes vulnerable to challenge and transformation. The absence of a royal heir represents one of the most profound crises that can befall a monarchy, threatening not merely the continuation of a dynasty but the very legitimacy of the monarchical system itself. When kings die without successors, they leave behind power vacuums that can trigger civil wars, foreign invasions, and fundamental restructuring of political authority. These succession crises reveal the fragile nature of hereditary rule and demonstrate how personal biology can determine the fate of entire nations. The death of Charles II of Spain in 1700 without legitimate heirs precipitated one of the most devastating succession crises in European history, ultimately leading to the War of the Spanish Succession that would reshape the continental balance of power for generations. Charles, the last Habsburg ruler of Spain, had been sickly throughout his life, suffering from the genetic consequences of centuries of inbreeding that had weakened the dynasty's reproductive capacity and mental stability. Charles's physical and mental disabilities made his reign a prolonged struggle against both domestic challenges and international pressures from powers seeking to position themselves for the inevitable succession crisis. His two marriages, first to Marie-Louise of Orleans and later to Maria Anna of Neuburg, failed to produce the heir that Spanish politics desperately required, leaving the vast Spanish Empire without clear legitimate succession. The king's awareness of his impending death without heirs led to increasingly frantic diplomatic maneuvering as European powers sought to influence his choice of successor. The competing claims of the Austrian Habsburgs, who argued for hereditary right, and the French Bourbons, who offered the promise of more effective rule, created a diplomatic crisis that began years before Charles's actual death. Charles's final will, which designated Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV of France, as his heir, represented an attempt to preserve Spanish imperial unity while acknowledging the practical realities of European power politics. However, this decision effectively guaranteed a major European war as other powers refused to accept French control over Spanish territories and trade networks. The War of the Spanish Succession that followed Charles's death demonstrated how royal succession crises could escalate into international conflicts that determined the fate of empires. The 13-year war involved virtually every major European power and resulted in fundamental changes to the continental political system, including the permanent separation of the French and Spanish crowns and the emergence of Great Britain as a major European power. The case of Edward the Confessor of England, who died childless in 1066, illustrates how succession crises in medieval contexts could invite foreign invasion and fundamentally alter national identity. Edward's long reign had been marked by his apparent lack of interest in producing heirs, possibly due to religious devotion or personal inclination, creating a succession uncertainty that various claimants sought to exploit. The competing claims of Harold Godwin's son, who was crowned immediately after Edward's death, and William of Normandy, who argued that Edward had promised him the succession, created the pretext for the Norman conquest that would transform English society, law, and culture. Edward's failure to provide clear succession arrangements made the crisis inevitable and the foreign conquest possible. William's successful invasion and victory at the Battle of Hastings represented more than just a change of dynasty. It marked the beginning of a new phase of English history in which Norman French culture and institutions would be imposed on Anglo-Saxon society. The succession crisis caused by Edward's childlessness thus became the mechanism through which England was integrated into the broader European feudal system. The death of Alexander III of Scotland in 1286 without male heirs created a succession crisis that would eventually lead to centuries of conflict between Scotland and England. Alexander's reign had been generally successful, marked by expansion of Scottish territory and consolidation of royal authority, but his failure to secure the succession created vulnerabilities that his enemies were quick to exploit. The succession passed to Alexander's granddaughter Margaret, the Maid of Norway, but her death in 1290 at the age of 7, while traveling to Scotland to claim her inheritance, left the kingdom without any clear legitimate heir. This crisis created the opportunity for Edward I of England to assert his authority as overlord of Scotland and to attempt to incorporate the Scottish kingdom into his expanding territorial domain. The resulting Wars of Scottish Independence, which began with Edward I's intervention in the Scottish succession dispute, would continue intermittently for centuries and fundamentally shape the relationship between Scotland and England. The original succession crisis caused by Alexander III's lack of male heirs thus became the foundation for a much larger conflict over Scottish independence and national identity. The extinction of the Arpad dynasty in Hungary with the death of Andrew III in 1301 illustrates how succession crises could create opportunities for foreign intervention and the establishment of new ruling families. The Arpads had ruled Hungary for over 3 centuries, establishing the kingdom's territorial boundaries and converting the population to Christianity, but their failure to maintain clear succession ultimately opened the way for foreign domination. The period following Andrew III's death was marked by competing claims from various European royal families, including the Angevins of Naples and the Přemyslids of Bohemia, each of whom argued that marriage connections to the extinct dynasty gave them legitimate rights to the Hungarian crown. This competition created a prolonged period of civil war and foreign intervention that weakened the kingdom and made it vulnerable to external threats. The eventual establishment of Angevin rule in Hungary under Charles Robert represented a victory for French-influenced politics over German-influenced alternatives, but it also marked the beginning of a period in which Hungarian independence would be increasingly compromised by the competing interests of major European powers. The death of Casimir III of Poland in 1370 without male heirs created a succession crisis that would fundamentally alter the political development of Eastern Europe. Casimir's reign had been marked by significant territorial expansion, legal codification, and cultural development that earned him the title the Great. But his failure to produce male successors created vulnerabilities that would reshape Polish politics for centuries. The succession passed to Casimir's nephew Louis I of Hungary, creating a personal union between the Polish and Hungarian kingdoms that brought both opportunities and complications. While this union provided Poland with additional military resources and international connections, it also created divided loyalties and competing priorities that would weaken both kingdoms in their struggles against external enemies. The subsequent election of Jadwiga as Queen of Poland and her marriage to Jogaila of Lithuania created the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, one of the largest and most powerful states in medieval Europe. However, this development was made possible only by the original succession crisis created by Casimir III's lack of male heirs, demonstrating how royal reproductive failures could create opportunities for dramatic political innovation. The extinction of the Piast dynasty in the Duchy of Silesia illustrates how succession crises could lead to the permanent loss of national independence. The various Silesian duchies had maintained their autonomy under Piast rule for centuries, but the gradual extinction of the dynasty through failure to produce heirs created opportunities for Habsburg expansion that would eventually incorporate these territories into the Austrian Empire. The case of the last Duke of Brittany, Francis II, who died in 1488 leaving only his daughter and his heir, demonstrates how succession crises could be manipulated by stronger neighbors to achieve territorial expansion. Anne's forced marriage to Charles VIII of France, followed later by her marriage to Louis XII, effectively ended Breton independence and incorporated the duchy into the French kingdom. These marriages were presented as voluntary unions between sovereign rulers, but the political and military pressures that surrounded them revealed their true nature as mechanisms for territorial conquest disguised as matrimonial diplomacy. Anne's position as the sole heir to Brittany made her simultaneously one of the most eligible brides in Europe and one of the most vulnerable rulers, as her marriage would determine not just her personal fate but the independence of her duchy. The death of Sebastian I of Portugal at the Battle of Alcácer Quibir in 1578, without heirs, precipitated a succession crisis that led to the temporary extinction of Portuguese independence under Spanish rule. Sebastian's military expedition to Morocco was partly motivated by his desire to establish his reputation as a crusading king worthy of his royal status. But his death in battle left Portugal without clear succession and vulnerable to Spanish claims. The ensuing succession dispute involved multiple claimants, including Philip II of Spain, who argued that his marriage to Sebastian's aunt gave him legitimate rights to the Portuguese crown. The Spanish military intervention that followed Sebastian's death resulted in the Union of Crowns that lasted from 1580 to 1640, during which Portugal lost much of its independence and imperial autonomy. The restoration of Portuguese independence under John IV in 1640 represented a successful revolt against foreign domination, but the original crisis that made Spanish rule possible stemmed directly from Sebastian's failure to secure the succession before embarking on his fatal military adventure. The case of Charles XII of Sweden, who died in 1718 without heirs during his campaign against Norway, illustrates how succession crises could accelerate the decline of great powers. Charles's military campaigns had extended Swedish power across northern and eastern Europe, but his death without succession arrangements created political instability that his enemies were quick to exploit. The succession passed to Charles's sister Ulrika Eleonora, but her weak political position and the exhaustion of Swedish resources after years of warfare made it impossible to maintain the territorial empire that Charles had created. The Great Northern War's conclusion marked the end of Swedish status as a major European power, a decline that was accelerated by the succession crisis following Charles's death. These cases of royal extinction reveal fundamental weaknesses in the hereditary principle that underlies monarchical government. They demonstrate that the biological accident of reproduction can determine the fate of nations and that even the most successful royal dynasties remain vulnerable to the simple failure to produce viable heirs. The political consequences of these succession crises extended far beyond the immediate kingdoms involved to reshape the entire European balance of power. Wars of succession became opportunities for territorial expansion, diplomatic realignment, and the emergence of new great powers at the expense of dynasties that had failed to secure their biological continuation. The modern constitutional monarchies that survived these historical crises did so largely by developing alternative mechanisms of succession that reduced their dependence on direct male heirs. The acceptance of female succession, the adoption of more distant hereditary claims, and the development of parliamentary systems that could function independently of royal personalities all represented adaptations to the persistent problem of dynastic extinction. The art of royal survival has always required a delicate balance between accessibility and protection, between displaying the divine grandeur of monarchy and acknowledging the mortal vulnerability of the person who wears the crown. Throughout history, successful monarchs have developed increasingly sophisticated strategies for detecting, preventing, and surviving the constant threats to their lives and authority that come with absolute power. These survival techniques reveal as much about the nature of political authority as they do about human ingenuity in the face of mortal danger. Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, perhaps perfected the art of royal survival through the creation of an elaborate court system at Versailles that transformed potential threats into dependent courtiers. Rather than simply relying on physical security measures, Louis understood that the most effective protection came from creating a political and social system where the nobility's interests were completely aligned with maintaining his authority and personal safety. The elaborate etiquette and ceremonial requirements of Versailles served multiple security functions beyond their obvious role in displaying royal magnificence. By requiring the highest nobles to attend the king personally during his daily routines, from his morning lever to his evening coucher, Louis ensured that potential conspirators were constantly under observation while simultaneously making them complicit in the royal system through their participation in its rituals. The king's famous declaration that l'état, c'est moi represented more than royal arrogance. It was a sophisticated security strategy that made attacks on his person equivalent to attacks on the French state itself. By identifying his personal welfare with national interests, Louis made it clear that conspiracies against him would be treated as treason against France, thereby raising the stakes for potential assassins and their supporters. Louis's use of spies and informants throughout his court created an atmosphere of surveillance that made conspiracy extremely difficult to organize or maintain. The king's network of intelligence gatherers, led by figures like Nicolas de la Reynie, penetrated every level of French society and made it virtually impossible for hostile plots to develop without detection. This system of mutual surveillance also served to isolate potential conspirators from each other, as no one could be certain who might be reporting to royal authorities. The physical layout of Versailles itself reflected sophisticated security considerations that were disguised as aesthetic and ceremonial choices. The palace's design, with its long sightlines, multiple exit routes, and carefully controlled access points, allowed for effective protection while maintaining the appearance of openness and accessibility that royal dignity required. The king's private apartments were positioned to provide maximum security, while still allowing for the public ceremonies that displayed royal magnificence. Richard III of England employed a very different survival strategy based on rapid military response and the cultivation of personal loyalty among key supporters. Richard's position as a usurper who had taken the throne from his nephews made him acutely aware of his vulnerability to both domestic rebellion and foreign invasion, requiring survival strategies that emphasized swift action and reliable intelligence. Richard's establishment of a network of trusted agents throughout England allowed him to detect and respond to threats before they could develop into serious challenges to his authority. His practice of rewarding loyal service with grants of land and titles created a class of supporters whose personal interests were directly tied to his continued rule, making them natural allies in detecting and suppressing conspiracy. The king's military reforms, including the creation of a more professional royal guard and the improvement of castle defenses throughout his realm, demonstrated his understanding that survival ultimately depended on the ability to meet force with superior force. Richard's emphasis on speed of response to threats reflected his awareness that delayed action could allow small conspiracies to grow into major rebellions. However, Richard's survival strategies ultimately failed because they were based primarily on fear and self-interest rather than genuine legitimacy or popular support. His death at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485 demonstrated that even the most sophisticated security measures could not compensate for fundamental political weaknesses or widespread opposition to his rule. Catherine de' Medici, as Queen Mother of France during the tumultuous period of the Wars of Religion, developed survival strategies that emphasized political flexibility, religious pragmatism, and the careful management of competing factions. Her position as a woman ruling through her sons required particularly subtle approaches to maintaining authority while avoiding the appearance of inappropriate female ambition. Catherine's famous tolerance for both Catholic and Protestant courtiers reflected not religious indifference but a sophisticated understanding that survival required avoiding complete identification with either side in the religious conflicts that were tearing France apart. By maintaining relationships with leaders of both religious factions, she created options for political maneuvering that might not have been available to a more doctrinally committed ruler. Her use of astrology, occultism, and other esoteric practices served important political functions beyond any personal beliefs she might have held. These activities created an aura of mysterious power that made potential enemies uncertain about her capabilities and resources, while also providing cover for intelligence gathering and political communication that might otherwise have appeared suspicious. Catherine's legendary ruthlessness in dealing with threats, including her alleged involvement in the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, demonstrated her understanding that royal survival sometimes required terrible choices. Her willingness to authorize extreme violence against potential enemies served both to eliminate immediate threats and to deter future challenges through the demonstration of her determination to preserve her authority at any cost. The elaborate food-tasting protocols and other security measures that surrounded Catherine's daily life reflected the constant awareness of assassination threats that characterized her reign. Her employment of Italian specialists in various arts, including both culinary and more sinister skills, demonstrated how royal survival could require expertise drawn from across Europe. Emperor Augustus of Rome, though ruling in an earlier era, established many of the fundamental principles of royal survival that would influence monarchs for centuries to come. His transformation from the Civil War leader Octavian into the revered Emperor Augustus required survival strategies that balanced the need for absolute power with the Roman Republic's traditional resistance to monarchical authority. Augustus's creation of the Praetorian Guard represented a revolutionary approach to royal security that recognized the need for a professional military force whose primary loyalty was to the emperor's person rather than to traditional Roman institutions. This elite unit served not only as personal bodyguards but as a visible symbol of imperial power that deterred potential challengers while reassuring the emperor's supporters. The emperor's careful cultivation of religious authority through his role as Pontifex Maximus and his eventual deification created additional layers of protection by making attacks on his person equivalent to sacrilege. This religious dimension of imperial authority would later influence Christian concepts of divine right monarchy and the sacred nature of royal persons. Augustus's use of adoption to create a stable succession while maintaining biological distance from potential rivals demonstrated sophisticated understanding of dynastic politics. By choosing capable successors from outside his immediate family, he avoided the succession crises that had plagued earlier Roman leaders while ensuring that his political system would survive his death. Elizabeth I of England developed survival strategies that were specifically adapted to the unique vulnerabilities of female monarchy in the 16th century. Her famous declaration that she had the heart and stomach of a king reflected her understanding that successful female rule required the projection of masculine virtues while maintaining the legitimacy that came from feminine purity and divine favor. Elizabeth's refusal to marry, while creating succession problems, served important security functions by preventing any husband from gaining authority that might challenge her own and by avoiding the foreign entanglements that marriage alliances typically brought. Her cultivation of the image of the Virgin Queen married to England created emotional bonds with her subjects that made attacks on her person seem like attacks on the nation itself. The Queen's famous progresses throughout England served multiple security functions beyond their obvious diplomatic and ceremonial purposes. These journeys allowed her to maintain personal relationships with local nobles whose loyalty was essential for detecting and suppressing regional conspiracies, while also demonstrating royal power and accessibility to ordinary subjects whose support was crucial for political stability. Elizabeth's use of intelligence networks, directed by figures like Sir Francis Walsingham, created one of the most sophisticated espionage systems in European history. These networks penetrated Catholic conspiracies, monitored foreign diplomatic activities, and provided early warning of potential threats from both domestic and international sources. The Queen's careful management of her public image through portraiture, poetry, and ceremonial display created a mythology of royal authority that made her seem larger than life while simultaneously emphasizing her essential Englishness and Protestant identity. This cultural dimension of royal survival demonstrated understanding that long-term security required popular support as well as military and diplomatic protection. Ivan the Terrible of Russia employed survival strategies based on systematic terror, institutional innovation, and the complete restructuring of Russian society to eliminate potential sources of opposition. His creation of the Oprachina, a parallel governmental structure loyal only to him, represented one of the most radical approaches to royal security in European history. The Oprachina's black-clad riders, with their symbols of dog heads and brooms indicating their role in hunting down and sweeping away the Tsar's enemies, created an atmosphere of terror that made conspiracy virtually impossible to maintain. This organization served not only to eliminate specific threats but to demonstrate the futility of resistance to Ivan's authority. Ivan's systematic destruction of the traditional boyar families that had historically challenged royal authority represented a permanent solution to the problem of aristocratic opposition. By eliminating entire bloodlines and redistributing their lands to service nobles whose status depended entirely on royal favor, he created a political system where survival required absolute loyalty to the Tsar. However, Ivan's survival strategies ultimately proved counterproductive because their extremity created new sources of instability and resistance. His reign of terror weakened Russian society and contributed to the time of troubles that followed his death, demonstrating that survival strategies based primarily on fear could create more problems than they solved. The evolution of royal survival strategies from medieval to modern times reflects broader changes in political organization, military technology, and social structure. Early monarchs relied primarily on personal loyalty and military force, while later rulers developed more sophisticated approaches based on bureaucratic control, popular support, and international diplomacy. Modern constitutional monarchies that have survived into the present era have done so largely by abandoning claims to absolute power in exchange for guaranteed security and ceremonial dignity. This transformation represents the ultimate evolution of royal survival strategy, the recognition that the best way to preserve monarchy may be to limit its political authority while maintaining its symbolic significance. The fall of ancient royal dynasties represents one of the most dramatic transformations in human history, marking the end of systems of government that had endured for centuries and the beginning of new political orders that would reshape the modern world. The collapse of the great European monarchies during the early 20th century created a class of displaced royalty, former emperors, kings, and archdukes who found themselves suddenly stripped of power, territory, and often life itself. Their stories reveal the fragility of even the most established political institutions and the personal tragedies that accompany historical transformation. The Romanov dynasty of Russia, which had ruled the vast Russian Empire for over 3 centuries, came to its catastrophic end in 1918 with the execution of Tsar Nicholas II and his entire family in a basement in Ekaterinburg. This brutal conclusion to centuries of imperial rule represented not merely the end of a dynasty but the violent destruction of an entire way of life that had defined Russian society since the time of Peter the Great. Nicholas II's abdication in March 1917, following military defeats and revolutionary upheaval, had initially seemed to offer the possibility of a peaceful transition to constitutional monarchy or republican government. The Tsar's decision to renounce the throne for both himself and his son Alexei reflected his growing awareness that the institution of autocracy had become incompatible with the demands of modern warfare and social change. However, the provisional government's decision to keep the imperial family under house arrest rather than allowing them to seek exile abroad ultimately sealed their fate. The Romanovs' continued presence in Russia made them a potential rallying point for counter-revolutionary forces, while their German connections through Tsarina Alexandra made them suspected enemies of the state during the ongoing World War. The family's captivity at the Alexander Palace and later in Tobolsk and Ekaterinburg revealed the profound personal costs of political upheaval. Nicholas, who had once commanded the loyalty of millions of subjects across 11 time zones, found himself reduced to chopping wood and tending a small garden under guard. Alexandra, the granddaughter of Queen Victoria, was forced to nurse her hemophiliac son while coping with her own chronic illnesses and the constant uncertainty of their future. The children Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and Alexei experienced the transition from imperial privilege to revolutionary captivity during their most formative years. Their letters and diary entries from this period reveal young people struggling to understand how their world had collapsed so completely and so suddenly. The young women, who had once been among Europe's most eligible princesses, found themselves sharing cramped quarters and performing menial household tasks. The decision to execute the entire family, made by local Bolshevik leaders in consultation with Moscow, reflected the revolutionary government's determination to eliminate any possibility of monarchist restoration. The brutal nature of their deaths, shot and bayonet in a basement before their bodies were disposed of in unmarked graves, demonstrated the revolutionaries' complete rejection of traditional concepts of royal dignity and divine right. The mystery surrounding the Romanov deaths, which persisted for decades until the discovery and identification of their remains in the 1990s, created a mythology of survival that provided psychological comfort to Russian monarchists and Orthodox believers who could not accept the complete extinction of the sacred dynasty. Claims by various pretenders to be surviving members of the family, most famously the numerous women who claimed to be Anastasia, reflected the deep human need to believe that such complete destruction was impossible. The Habsburg dynasty, while avoiding the violent fate of the Romanovs, experienced an equally complete loss of power and territory with the collapse of Austria-Hungary at the end of World War I. Emperor Franz Joseph, who had ruled for 68 years and embodied the multinational empire's complex identity, died in 1916 just as the forces that would destroy his realm were gathering strength. His successor, Emperor Charles I, inherited a disintegrating empire facing military defeat, ethnic rebellion, and economic collapse. Charles's attempts to negotiate a separate peace with the Allies and his promises of federal reform to satisfy nationalist demands came too late to save the monarchy or prevent the empire's dismemberment into successor states. The Habsburg family's exile from Austria in 1919 marked the end of a dynasty that had once controlled much of Central and Eastern Europe for over 6 centuries. Unlike the Romanovs, the Habsburgs survived physically, but their political extinction was equally complete. Charles's death in exile on the island of Madeira in 1922, after failed attempts to reclaim his Hungarian throne, symbolized the futility of monarchist restoration in the new European order. The dispersal of the Habsburg family across Europe created a diaspora of former royalty who struggled to find meaning and purpose in a world that no longer had place for their traditional roles. Some, like Archduke Franz Ferdinand's children, adapted to middle-class life and professional careers. Others, like the pretender Otto von Habsburg, spent decades in political exile while maintaining claims to thrones that no longer existed. The loss of the imperial palaces, Schönbrunn, the Hofburg, and dozens of other residences across the former empire represented more than just the forfeiture of property. These buildings had been the physical embodiment of Habsburg power and the ceremonial centers of imperial authority. Their conversion to museums and government offices marked the definitive transformation of symbols of royal power into tourist attractions and historical curiosities. The fate of the Habsburg crown jewels, including the ancient crown of the Holy Roman Empire, reflected the broader challenge of preserving monarchical traditions without monarchical institutions. These objects, once the sacred symbols of imperial authority, became museum pieces divorced from their original political significance while retaining their artistic and historical value. The German Kaiser Wilhelm II's exile to the Netherlands following Germany's defeat in World War I represented another dramatic fall from imperial power to private citizenship. Wilhelm's flight from Germany in November 1918, as revolutionary forces swept across the country, marked the end of the Hohenzollern dynasty's centuries-long rule over Prussia and the German Empire. Wilhelm's exile at Housdorn became a curious anachronism, a deposed emperor maintaining the protocols and ceremonies of imperial court life in a modest Dutch manor house. His daily routines, including formal dress for meals and the maintenance of military schedules, represented an attempt to preserve dignity and identity in circumstances that had stripped him of all real authority. The former Kaiser's writings and statements during his exile revealed a man struggling to understand how his empire had collapsed so rapidly and completely. His tendency to blame Germany's defeat on betrayal by civilians and socialists, rather than acknowledging his own role in the catastrophe, reflected the psychological difficulty of accepting responsibility for such complete failure. Wilhelm's death in 1941 during the Nazi occupation of the Netherlands created the poignant irony of a former German emperor dying under the rule of a regime that had utterly repudiated the monarchical values he represented. His modest funeral, conducted under German military occupation, symbolized how completely the world had moved beyond the imperial grandeur he had once embodied. The Ottoman Empire's dissolution after World War I created yet another class of displaced royalty, as the Turkish Republic established by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk explicitly rejected both imperial and Islamic monarchical traditions. Sultan Mehmed Vi's departure from Constantinople in 1922 marked the end of over 6 centuries of Ottoman rule and the beginning of a secular, republican Turkey that had no place for traditional Islamic monarchy. The fate of the Ottoman imperial family, scattered across Europe in exile, illustrated the particular challenges facing Muslim royalty in an increasingly secular world. Unlike Christian monarchs who could maintain some ceremonial or symbolic significance, the Ottoman Sultan Calipha's religious authority was completely rejected by the new Turkish state, making any form of accommodation impossible. The Portuguese monarchy's overthrow in 1910, which sent King Manuel II into exile in England, demonstrated that even relatively stable constitutional monarchies could fall victim to republican movements and military coups. Manuel's long exile in Britain, where he lived as a private gentleman scholar until his death in 1932, represented the transformation of a reigning monarch into a historical curiosity. The Brazilian imperial family's exile following the establishment of the Republic in 1889 created the unusual situation of a tropical empire's rulers adapting to European exile. Emperor Pedro II's dignified acceptance of his overthrow and his refusal to attempt restoration efforts contrasted sharply with the more aggressive approaches of other deposed monarchs, but ultimately proved equally ineffective in preserving monarchical institutions. These stories of dynastic collapse and royal displacement reveal common patterns in the transformation of European political systems during the early 20th century. The combination of military defeat, economic crisis, and social revolution created conditions where even the most established monarchies could be swept away with surprising speed and completeness. The personal adaptations of displaced royalty to their new circumstances ranged from dignified acceptance to desperate attempts at restoration. Some former monarchs, like Alfonso XIII of Spain, eventually returned to their countries as private citizens. Others, like the Romanovs, paid the ultimate price for their identification with discredited political systems. The cultural and psychological impact of these dynastic extinctions extended far beyond the immediate political consequences. The destruction of centuries-old institutions created a sense of historical discontinuity that influenced art, literature, and popular culture throughout the 20th century. The romantic mythology surrounding lost monarchies provided material for countless novels, films, and historical fantasies that reflected nostalgia for a more ordered and hierarchical world. The survival of some European monarchies into the present era required fundamental adaptations that essentially transformed them into entirely different institutions. The constitutional monarchies that endured did so by abandoning claims to real political power while maintaining ceremonial and symbolic functions that satisfied public desires for historical continuity and national identity. The ultimate lesson of these royal falls is that no political institution, however ancient or seemingly secure, is immune to the forces of historical change. The dynasties that ruled Europe for centuries proved as vulnerable to transformation as any other human institution when confronted with changes in military technology, economic organization, and social consciousness that made their traditional roles obsolete. The royal court has always been a battlefield disguised as a ballroom, where the most elegant gestures could conceal deadly intentions, and where a misplaced word or an ill-timed bow could spell the difference between elevation and execution. Palace intrigue represents the dark art of political manipulation at its most refined and most ruthless, where the stakes were nothing less than kingdoms and the players wielded weapons of charm, cunning, and calculated betrayal rather than swords and cannons. The Tudor court of England under Henry VIII stands as perhaps the most notorious example of royal intrigue transforming personal relationships into matters of life and death. The king's volatile temperament and his obsession with male succession created an atmosphere where courtiers, ministers, and queens themselves lived in constant fear of falling from royal favor with catastrophic consequences. Thomas Cromwell's rise from blacksmith's son to the king's chief minister illustrated how palace intrigue could elevate the most unlikely figures to positions of enormous power. Cromwell's success was built on his ability to provide Henry with what he wanted most: divorce from Catherine of Aragon and independence from papal authority, while simultaneously enriching the crown through the dissolution of the monasteries. However, Cromwell's fall was equally dramatic and demonstrated the precarious nature of royal favor. His arrangement of Henry's marriage to and of Cleves, which the king found personally distasteful, provided his enemies with the opportunity they needed to convince Henry that his chief minister had become a liability. The speed with which Cromwell went from indispensable advisor to executed traitor revealed how quickly palace intrigue could destroy even the most powerful court figures. The competition between different factions at Henry's court, the religious conservatives led by the Duke of Norfolk versus the reformers supported by Thomas Cranmer, created a complex web of alliances and betrayals that influenced every aspect of royal policy. Courtiers had to choose sides carefully while remaining flexible enough to survive changes in the king's favor and the periodic purges that eliminated entire factions. The fate of Henry's queens themselves illustrated the ultimate consequences of palace intrigue when it involved the royal marriage bed. Anne Boleyn's execution on charges of adultery and treason was orchestrated by court enemies who understood that destroying the queen was the most effective way to reshape royal policy and eliminate a powerful political faction. Catherine Howard's execution followed a similar pattern, with court rivals using her premarital relationships and alleged adultery to convince Henry that his young wife posed a threat to royal dignity and dynasty security. The ease with which enemies could manipulate the king's fears and insecurities demonstrated how palace intrigue could exploit royal psychology for political advantage. The French court under Louis XIV developed palace intrigue into a sophisticated art form that channeled aristocratic ambition into harmless competition for ceremonial honors and court positions. The elaborate etiquette of Versailles served not only to display royal magnificence but to create a system where nobles competed for the privilege of handing the king his shirt rather than plotting rebellion against his authority. The Sun King's genius lay in understanding that the most effective way to neutralize potential threats was to make conspiracy practically impossible through constant surveillance and mutual dependence. By requiring the greatest nobles to attend court regularly and participate in elaborate ceremonies, Louis ensured that potential rebels were always under observation while becoming financially dependent on royal favor. The competition for royal attention at Versailles created intricate networks of alliance and rivalry that absorbed aristocratic energy that might otherwise have been directed toward political opposition. The famous incident where the Duc de Saint-Simon spent months maneuvering for the right to sit in the king's presence illustrated how palace intrigue could transform serious political ambitions into obsessions with ceremonial precedence. Louis's use of his mistresses as informal channels of influence created additional layers of court intrigue as various factions sought to gain access to royal favor through these relationships. The rivalry between Madame de Montespan and Madame de Maintenon represented not just personal competition but a broader struggle between different approaches to royal policy and religious authority. The affair of the poisons, which implicated numerous court figures in murder plots and occult practices, revealed the dark undercurrents of palace life beneath the glittering surface of Versailles ceremonies. The king's decision to suppress most of the evidence and avoid public trials demonstrated his understanding that exposing the full extent of court corruption would damage the monarchy's reputation more than the actual crimes themselves. The Russian court under Catherine the Great developed its own distinctive forms of palace intrigue that reflected the unique challenges of governing a vast empire with a complex mix of European and Asian traditions. Catherine's rise to power through the overthrow and murder of her husband Peter III established precedents for court conspiracy that would haunt Russian politics for generations. Catherine's relationship with Grigory Potemkin represented one of the most successful examples of how palace favorites could achieve genuine political partnership with their royal patrons. Potemkin's role as both lover and chief minister created a unique form of court intrigue where personal intimacy and political authority were completely intertwined, allowing for unprecedented coordination of policy while creating vulnerabilities that rivals constantly sought to exploit. The Empress's management of successive male favorites after Potemkin required sophisticated political skills to prevent these relationships from undermining her authority or creating opportunities for palace coups. Her ability to maintain control over these potentially destabilizing relationships while using them to gather intelligence and maintain political flexibility demonstrated mastery of palace intrigue at its most complex level. The rivalry between different court factions, the supporters of European modernization versus advocates of traditional Russian values, created ongoing intrigue that influenced everything from military appointments to territorial expansion. Catherine's success in balancing these competing interests while advancing her own agenda illustrated how skilled monarchs could use palace intrigue to strengthen rather than weaken their authority. The Chinese imperial court developed perhaps the most elaborate and institutionalized forms of palace intrigue in human history, with the Forbidden City serving as the stage for centuries of carefully orchestrated competition for imperial favor. The complex hierarchy of court positions and the rigid protocols governing access to the emperor created opportunities for intrigue that were simultaneously more subtle and more deadly than their European counterparts. The role of court eunuchs in Chinese palace intrigue reflected the unique challenges of governing through a system where access to the emperor was mediated by figures who had sacrificed their biological capacity for advancement in order to serve imperial authority. These individuals often accumulated enormous informal power while remaining officially subordinate to the imperial family and formal government ministers. The competition between imperial consorts for the emperor's favor and the succession of their children created ongoing palace dramas that could determine the fate of the empire. The elaborate rules governing imperial marriages and the complex systems of precedence among the emperor's women reflected attempts to manage these rivalries while preventing them from destabilizing the dynasty. The Spanish court under Philip II developed intrigue patterns that were shaped by the king's notorious secrecy and his preference for governing through written correspondence rather than face-to-face consultation. This system created opportunities for courtiers who could influence the king's access to information while making it extremely difficult for rivals to understand what advice was actually reaching the monarch. Philip's use of multiple councils and competing bureaucracies created institutional rivalries that mirrored personal court intrigue, while serving the king's interests by preventing any single faction from gaining too much influence. The constant tension between different administrative bodies meant that courtiers had to build alliances across institutional boundaries while remaining vulnerable to changes in royal favor. The famous case of Antonio Perez, Philip's former secretary who fell from grace and fled the kingdom, illustrated how palace intrigue could escalate into international incidents when disgraced courtiers sought foreign support for their attempts at revenge or restoration. Perez's flight to France and his publication of embarrassing royal secrets demonstrated how court rivalries could become matters of international diplomacy and dynastic reputation. The English court under Elizabeth I developed its own distinctive patterns of intrigue that reflected the unique challenges of female monarchy in a male-dominated political system. The Queen's refusal to marry created both opportunities and dangers for courtiers who sought to influence royal policy through personal relationships that could never be formalized through marriage. The competition between different suitors for Elizabeth's hand, both genuine and merely tactical, created elaborate courtship rituals that served multiple political functions while providing cover for more serious forms of political maneuvering. The Queen's famous skill in managing these relationships without surrendering her independence represented a masterclass in using romantic intrigue for political advantage. The rivalry between different court factions, the supporters of aggressive Protestant foreign policy versus advocates of more cautious diplomatic approaches, created ongoing tensions that the Queen managed through careful distribution of favor and the strategic use of her unmarried status to maintain diplomatic flexibility. The fall of the Earl of Essex, once Elizabeth's most favored courtier, demonstrated how palace intrigue could destroy even the most privileged court figures when ambition exceeded political judgment. Essex's attempted coup in 1601 represented the failure of traditional medieval approaches to court rivalry in a context where royal authority had become too institutionalized to be challenged through personal violence. These examples of royal intrigue reveal common patterns in how monarchs and courtiers navigated the dangerous waters of palace politics. Successful rulers learned to use intrigue to strengthen their authority by playing different factions against each other while preventing any single group from gaining enough influence to challenge royal supremacy. The most effective courtiers understood that long-term success required not just winning royal favor but maintaining it through changing political circumstances and evolving royal preferences. This required sophisticated understanding of royal psychology and the ability to anticipate political changes before they became obvious to rivals. Palace intrigue also served important functions in royal governance by providing alternative channels of information and influence that could bypass formal bureaucratic structures. Monarchs often learned more about their kingdoms through informal court networks than through official reports, making skilled management of palace relationships essential for effective rule. The decline of traditional palace intrigue in modern constitutional monarchies reflects broader changes in political organization that have separated ceremonial monarchy from actual governance. Contemporary royal courts maintain some elements of traditional protocol and hierarchy, but the stakes of court rivalry have been dramatically reduced by the elimination of real political power from monarchical institutions. The traditional narrative of monarchy suggests that kings are born, not made, that royal authority flows naturally from divine appointment and hereditary succession. However, history reveals a far more complex and dramatic reality where some of the most significant monarchs achieved their thrones through audacity, ambition, and carefully orchestrated challenges to established order. These unconventional paths to power demonstrate that royal authority, despite its claims to divine sanction, has always been vulnerable to individuals bold enough to seize it and clever enough to legitimize their seizure. Napoleon Bonaparte's transformation from artillery officer to emperor of the French represents perhaps the most spectacular example of manufactured monarchy in European history. Born into minor Corsican nobility just as the island became French territory, Napoleon possessed neither the bloodline nor the initial political connections that traditionally led to royal power. His rise depended entirely on his ability to exploit the chaos of revolutionary France and his genius for combining military prowess with political manipulation. Napoleon's early recognition that the French Revolution had created opportunities for merit-based advancement rather than birth-based privilege allowed him to envision possibilities that would have been inconceivable under the old regime. His rapid promotion through military ranks during the Revolutionary Wars demonstrated how periods of political upheaval could accelerate careers that might otherwise have remained forever obscure. The young general's understanding that military success could be converted into political authority led him to cultivate public image and political connections even while conducting campaigns across Europe. His marriage to Josephine de Beauharnais connected him to networks of revolutionary society, while his victories in Italy and Egypt established his reputation as a leader capable of delivering the glory and territorial expansion that French nationalism demanded. Napoleon's seizure of power through the coup of 18 Brumaire in 1799 demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how to exploit political instability while maintaining appearances of constitutional legitimacy. By positioning himself as the defender of revolutionary achievements against both royalist restoration and radical extremism, he created a political identity that could appeal to multiple constituencies simultaneously. The transformation of Napoleon from first consul to emperor required even more complex political maneuvering, as he had to convince French society that accepting a new form of monarchy was compatible with revolutionary principles. His coronation in 1804, where he famously crowned himself in the presence of Pope Pius VII, symbolized his determination to create imperial authority that derived from his own achievements rather than from traditional sources of royal legitimacy. Napoleon's creation of a new nobility based on merit and service rather than birth represented a revolutionary approach to royal authority that influenced European political development for generations. By granting titles and honors to his most successful generals and administrators, he built a power structure that combined traditional monarchical hierarchy with revolutionary meritocracy. However, Napoleon's ultimate failure demonstrated the limitations of manufactured monarchy when confronted with the combined opposition of established European powers. His defeat and exile revealed that imperial authority based purely on personal achievement and military success remained vulnerable to changes in fortune that hereditary monarchy, with its claims to divine sanction and historical continuity, might have better weathered. Henry VII of England's path to the throne through victory at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485 illustrates how military conquest could create royal legitimacy even when hereditary claims were questionable. Henry Tudor's assertion of royal authority was based on his defeat of Richard III and his subsequent marriage to Elizabeth of York, which symbolically united the warring houses of Lancaster and York after decades of civil conflict. Henry's claim to the throne through his mother's Lancastrian connections was tenuous at best, making his victory at Bosworth essential for establishing any credible royal authority. His success demonstrated how military prowess and political timing could overcome genealogical disadvantages when existing royal authority had been weakened by prolonged conflict and disputed succession. The new king's immediate efforts to legitimize his rule through marriage alliance, papal recognition, and the creation of new court ceremonies revealed his understanding that military conquest alone was insufficient for long-term royal authority. His marriage to Elizabeth of York served multiple functions. It united competing dynastic claims, demonstrated his commitment to ending civil war, and provided the biological foundation for a new Tudor dynasty. Henry's paranoid attention to potential challenges from Yorkist pretenders like Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck illustrated the ongoing vulnerabilities of monarchs whose authority derived from conquest rather than unquestioned hereditary right. His elaborate security measures and his careful cultivation of noble loyalty demonstrated how unconventional monarchs had to work harder than traditional rulers to maintain their authority. The establishment of the Tudor court's distinctive culture, with its emphasis on royal magnificence and artistic patronage, represented Henry's attempt to create psychological and cultural supports for dynastic authority that could supplement the military and political foundations of his rule. His son Henry VIII would inherit and expand these innovations, ultimately creating one of the most powerful monarchies in European history. Oliver Cromwell's brief experiment with republican monarchy as Lord Protector of England demonstrated how revolutionary leaders could adopt monarchical forms while rejecting traditional royal legitimacy. Cromwell's rise from minor gentleman to supreme authority over the British Isles was made possible by the complete breakdown of traditional political order during the English Civil War and his exceptional abilities as both military commander and political organizer. Cromwell's reluctant acceptance of quasi-monarchical authority reflected the practical difficulties of governing without traditional forms of legitimacy and hierarchy. His adoption of royal ceremonies, his establishment of a court protocol, and his consideration of accepting the crown itself revealed how even committed republicans could be drawn toward monarchical solutions when confronted with the realities of governance. However, the collapse of the Protectorate after Cromwell's death and the restoration of traditional monarchy under Charles II demonstrated the limitations of republican monarchy when it lacked deep institutional foundations or broad popular support. The speed with which English society embraced the return of hereditary kingship suggested that revolutionary experiments with alternative forms of authority remained vulnerable to conservative reaction. Catherine the Great's transformation from German princess to Russian empress through the overthrow and murder of her husband Peter III represents one of the most successful examples of royal authority achieved through palace conspiracy and political courage. Catherine's rise demonstrated how intelligent and determined individuals could exploit the vulnerabilities of established monarchies to create new forms of royal legitimacy. Catherine's early years in Russia as the wife of the heir apparent had provided her with intimate knowledge of court politics and the weaknesses of existing royal authority. Her cultivation of relationships with key military and political figures during Peter III's brief reign positioned her to act decisively when his unpopular policies created opportunities for challenge. The Empress's success in maintaining power after her initial coup required sophisticated political skills that went far beyond mere conspiracy. Her adoption of Enlightenment principles, her territorial expansion of the Russian Empire, and her cultural patronage created achievements that retrospectively justified her unconventional path to power while establishing foundations for long-term dynastic authority. Catherine's creation of a new court culture that combined Russian traditions with European sophistication demonstrated how successful usurpers could use cultural innovation to legitimize political revolution. Her transformation of St. Petersburg into one of Europe's most magnificent capitals served both practical functions in impressing foreign observers and psychological functions in convincing Russian society of her fitness to rule. Bernadotte's elevation from French Marshal to King of Sweden represents a unique example of how military merit and political opportunism could create entirely new royal dynasties. Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte's adoption by the childless Swedish King Charles XIII and his subsequent founding of the current Swedish royal house demonstrated how European political instability could create unprecedented opportunities for social mobility. Bernadotte's success in Sweden required him to abandon his French identity and revolutionary sympathies in favor of Swedish nationalism and constitutional monarchy. His transformation from Napoleon's general to Sweden's king illustrated the complex process of political reinvention that unconventional rulers often had to undergo to maintain their authority. The survival of the Bernadotte dynasty into the present era, while most European monarchies created during the Napoleonic period collapsed, suggests that successful manufactured monarchy required not just the seizure of power but the creation of sustainable political institutions and genuine popular legitimacy. Simón Bolívar's brief experiment with establishing republican monarchy in Gran Colombia demonstrated how revolutionary leaders in the Americas could be attracted to monarchical solutions even while fighting wars of independence against European kings. Bolívar's consideration of accepting a crown for himself revealed the persistent appeal of monarchical authority even among committed republicans when confronted with the challenges of governing newly independent territories. However, the failure of Bolívar's monarchical ambitions and the subsequent fragmentation of Gran Colombia into separate republics illustrated the difficulties of establishing sustainable royal authority in societies that had been shaped by revolutionary ideology and egalitarian principles. The American revolutions ultimately proved more resistant to monarchical restoration than their European counterparts. These examples of unconventional paths to royal power reveal common patterns in how determined individuals could exploit political instability to achieve monarchical authority. Successful usurpers typically combined military prowess with political intelligence, cultural sophistication with practical governance skills, and revolutionary audacity with conservative legitimization strategies. The most enduring unconventional monarchies were those that managed to create new forms of legitimacy that could supplement or replace traditional hereditary claims. This often required adopting the symbols and ceremonies of traditional monarchy while creating new justifications for royal authority based on merit, achievement, or popular support. The decline of manufactured monarchy in the modern era reflects broader changes in political organization that have made traditional royal authority increasingly anachronistic. Contemporary political systems offer alternative paths to power through democratic politics, while international law and institutions make military conquest or revolutionary seizure of power more difficult to sustain or legitimize. As we conclude this journey through the hidden chambers and shadowed corridors of royal history, we see how the institution of monarchy, despite its claims to divine sanction and eternal legitimacy, has always been shaped by the most human of emotions and motivations: love and hatred, ambition and fear, loyalty and betrayal. These fundamental aspects of human nature have driven the great dramas of royal history and determined the fate of kingdoms. The relationships we have explored between kings and their favorites, monarchs and their spouses, rulers and their subjects, reveal that royal authority has always been as much about personal connections as about institutional power. The most successful monarchs understood that crowns might be inherited, but loyalty had to be earned and maintained through constant attention to the complex web of relationships that sustained their authority. The tragedies we have witnessed, the execution of kings, the exile of dynasties, the collapse of empires, demonstrate that no political institution, however ancient or seemingly secure, is immune to the forces of historical change. The monarchies that survived into the modern era did so by adapting to new circumstances, while those that clung too rigidly to traditional forms found themselves swept away by the tides of revolution and reform. Perhaps most significantly, these stories reveal that history is made not by abstract forces or inevitable trends, but by individual human beings making choices in specific circumstances. The decisions made in royal bedchambers and palace corridors, the relationships forged in court ceremonies and diplomatic negotiations, the personal tragedies played out against backdrops of imperial grandeur, these intimate human dramas have shaped the broader course of human civilization in ways that are still being felt today. In our modern world, where traditional monarchy has largely given way to democratic governance and constitutional limitation, These stories serve as reminders of both the achievements and the dangers of concentrated political power. They illustrate the importance of institutional checks on authority while revealing the persistent human fascination with the symbols and ceremonies of majesty. The unusual royal relationships we have explored continue to captivate our imagination because they represent the eternal human struggle between public duty and private desire, between the demands of power and the needs of the heart. In the end, these stories remind us that beneath every crown sits a human being, with all the strengths and weaknesses, hopes and fears that define our common humanity. As the last candles burn low in the palace halls and the echoes of ancient ceremonies fade into memory, we are left with the understanding that the most profound lessons of royal history are not about the exercise of power, but about the price of wielding it and the human costs of political ambition. In these timeless truths, we find not just entertainment but wisdom for navigating our own complex relationships between authority and humanity in whatever form they may take.